Dormouse Group. I know that no one's really interested in listening to the Support Act ever, so I'm not going to talk too long because you're obviously waiting for the main event. Just a bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions, if you wouldn't mind just putting them in the chat box and leaving them till later, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end. And also, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, just so we don't have any heavy breathing whilst whilst Ian's talking. Michael Walker, one of our data officers, is on standby as acting technical director. So hopefully, if anything goes awry, he will be there to assist us. Yeah, I'm just going to introduce Ian in a second. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to the Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust's Keeping It Wild youth team, who's allowed us to use their Zoom account today. Obviously, the Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group are a voluntary organisation. We don't get any outside funding, so just the assistance of this Zoom account is really useful. Just want to tell you about a few future webinars. We're going to have one on the Nottinghamshire Dormouse project, which will be run by committee members of the group, myself and Michael mostly. Leo Guber, who's doing his PhD on hibernating dormice down in Devon, is going to be doing one on the tails of hibernation, looking at where you're likely to find the dormice when they're in hibernation, what sort of nest materials, and also how to go about searching for hibernation nests during the winter. And I'll be doing one on surveying techniques, mainly concentrating on footprints tunnels, which is the new useful technique for searching for dormice for presence and absence. We've not really got any dates confirmed yet, but just keep an eye on our website and there'll be information to come. Email addresses, so there's our website, which is www.notsdormousegroup.uk, which has always been updated, so bear with us. And then for membership inquiries, if you just contact the Nots Dormouse Group at gmail.com, and we'll put you on our mailing list. So without much more ado, I'm just introduced Ian White. So Ian and I have been friends for several years. He's been really supportive of the work that the Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group have been doing. And he is what's your title now, Ian?
Dormouse and Training Officer.
So he works for the PTES. I'm going to leave it over to Ian now.
Okay, well, good evening. Okay, let's share my screen. Right, I think I'm shared. Right, okay, well, good evening, everyone. Laura invited me to do this. I wasn't entirely sure of my audience. I thought it was the Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group predominantly, but I see there's people from Surrey as well, which is quite exciting. So one of the great advantages of doing meetings or talks through Zoom and Teams is actually you can obviously get a much larger and broader audience. So it's been quite interesting what you can do with these. Long may it continue, I think. Anyway, I talk about dormice a lot. Obviously, I've been working with dormice for well in excess of 20 years now, and I work solely on the species. I don't work on anything else. And generally, I do talks on dormouse ecology, dormouse conservation, where we are in terms of the conservation side from dormouse in the UK. But I decided to change it tonight a bit. I thought I would talk about the Dormouse Reintroduction Programme, which has been running since 1992, 1993, and I've been managing since 2013, and it kind of leads up to the work that's been done in Nottinghamshire, so I'll kind of touch on that a bit as well. And also just talk a bit about what we've learnt from over 20 years of reintroducing dormice in areas in the UK. So, to think about the first reintroduction of dormice in the UK, we have to go all the way back to 1885. This was a paper written by George Rope, and this was pretty much what we base a lot of our knowledge on, certainly on the range of dormice in this country now, is we base it on this paper. And he actually commented within the introduction of this paper that actually there's a marked scarcity of dormice in two of the most easterly counties, Lincolnshire and also Norfolk and Suffolk. Suffolk populations we've been getting or been made a lot more aware of recently due to the work of Simone Bullion over in that county. But we've always been fairly confident that actually there's never been a population of dormice in Norfolk. But it says later on in that paper, it actually says that a site at Gelderston Hall in Norfolk, that dormice were found, but there's a strong suspicion they're actually put there by the landowner. So this is possibly the first recorded Dormouse reintroduction of taking 6 dormice from a site in Surrey, site unknown, and then shifting them across to Norfolk. As far as I'm aware, they're certainly not there now, but it's kind of that bulge in Norfolk there. So this possibly is, as I say, the first reintroduction. The other thing we get from that paper in 1985 is we get the map on the left-hand side. So that's pretty much the Victorian distribution of dormice in England and Wales. And southern counties are where dormice are considered to be frequent, occasional kind of around the borders and into the north as well. And occasional is population between 5 and 30 known populations. Rare is less than 5 known populations, and obviously absence speaks for itself. So that's where they were based on that 1885 paper, that's where dormice were. And then on more recent data, basically you can see the map on the right-hand side shows that dormice have been lost from pretty much all the Midland and Northern counties. And although Cumbria looks pretty good, there's only 1 known population in Cumbria now. So over the last 100 years, we've kind of lost dormice from most of the Midland and Northern counties. So this information has been written up in the paper, The State of Britain's Dormice, and those that made it to the international or the National Dormouse Conference last year. This was tied into the release of this publication, The State of Britain's Dormice 2019, where PTES showed that actually hazel dormice had declined by 51%, so it's a population decline, and there's also a range decline, having been lost from 17 counties in the last 100 years. So you've got a declining population and loss of the population from a number of counties as well. So reduction in range, decline in dormouse population, that led to the establishment of the NDMP, the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme, which was set up to monitor the UK's dormouse population. Dormouse became fully protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act in 1988, which makes them one of the most protected of UK species. And the Dormouse BAP was created in 1997, which was to maintain, enhance and reintroduce dormice. So it's maintain populations where they were known to exist, enhance where you could improve populations or could include the status for them, and reintroduce where dormice had been shown to become extinct. So that's kind of where the whole reintroduction, the idea of reintroduction really started. And kind of the first reintroduction was at a wood called Hayleywood in 1992. This was run by a lady, Dot Eaton, who was at Chessington Zoo. And it just shows you really how much things have changed. So this wasn't sanctioned by anybody. This was pretty much, she wanted to do this off her own bat. She got involved with a number of other people, and they released their first dormice towards the end of August in 1992. And they released 11 dormice in 2 family groups. So 2 adult females, 1 adult male, and 2 unspecified young. I don't know the sex of those ones. And also another individual, one female adult and her 5 young. So 11 dormice were released on the 28th of August. They were left in the cage for about a month, and then on the 23rd of September, that cage was open and the animals were then free to come and go. Following spring, they decided to supplement their population a bit, and they put in a further 6 female animals. And when they did that, they did, and again, it's changed a lot, as you'll see from as I talk through more reintroductions. They put all the animals in a large release cage, which was set up in the middle of the wood. The animals were kind of free to run around that cage, and then after a month, an opening was made, so they're then allowed to come and go within the woodland. There were checks undertaken in May and June in 1993, so the year after the release, and they found one adult female and a litter of young. But no further checks done at all. And then in 2011, 19 years after the first reintroduction, signs of dormice found again. That's reported in Dot Eaton's book. I have to say, I've got no idea what those signs are at all, basically. It just doesn't specify, just as the signs. And I remember visiting that wood, I think in about 2014, looked completely unsuitable for dormice now. It may well have been at the time. And I was shown these rather odd twiggy nests that the local people were convinced they were dormice. But these were quite substantial twigs. They're kind of, I suppose, 5 or 10 millimeters in diameter. So the thought of a dormouse making a nest out of twig, I certainly never see anything like it. And when I kind of checked with others, because I didn't believe they were dormice at all, they verified and said absolutely no chance they're crow's nests or birds' nests. They're certainly not dormice. So The first reintroduction failed, and I suspect to know the reason why. I suspect there are a number of reasons why, actually. I'll say we'll perhaps come back to it as I lead through the talk as how things changed. So that was the first one, Hayleywood 1992, that was in Hertfordshire. 1994, then the two people, Pat Morris and Paul Bright, who you may have heard of, did a lot of work on kind of dormice and put dormice research on the map. And they wrote this paper, Animal Translocation for Conservation. So this was a way of looking at how do we put a scientific methodology of how we reintroduce dormice into the UK. And they showed that actually the soft releases, which is the way we do things now, supplementary ingredient, putting nest boxes into the woods, all helps kind of allow the dormouse population to establish themselves. And that's kind of the method we still use. It's been tweaked slightly, but that's generally what we still use to this day. So after that first paper, this then was picked up by Natural England, and the Dormouse Reintroduction Programme became part of the Natural England, or English Nature as it was at the time, Species Recovery Programme. So it's sanctioned by the statutory agency. So the reintroduction became almost a lot more official, I suppose, if you like. So in the early days, they were undertaken and done by Royal Holloway, but this was the first one, first in a sanctioned one. So this was Brampton Wood down in Cambridgeshire. 19 dormice released in 1993, then they released another 30 in 1994. Quite a large woodland, it's about 80 hectares, so quite a sizable wood. You can see the little map at the in the bottom left. So the dormouse release was taken in area A, that's where the dormouse release cages were, and that's where they went. Over time, dormice dispersed all through that wood. They're still there, they're still occupying the wood. And there's evidence they've started to move out and spread out into the hedgerow network around the woodland as well, which I think is interesting in terms of that was done in 1993, and we're now starting to get evidence that dormice are spreading out from that wood. Okay, it's a big wood, but these things take time. And in preparation for this talk, I did look at one of the papers written by Pat Morris. And he was reviewing what had gone on at the Brampton Wood release. And one of his comments is actually, well, how do we measure success? And one way to measure success would be to look in 100 years' time, are dormice still there? It's not next week, next year, not 10 years' time, not 20 years' time. He was suggesting 100 years' time. It's taken us 100 years to lose dormice from areas. So perhaps that's kind of how we measure success, is are they still there in 100 years' time? But 1993, as I say, that they're still there. That wood's still doing pretty well. The wood itself is owned by Cambridgeshire Wildlife Trust. It's ongoing management, and quite a lot of effort going into to looking after the wood, and say that it's keeping the population going as well. So one other thing that came out of that as well. So Brampton Wood, you can see kind of in the upper right corner there. And one of my thoughts when I first saw this site, which is probably about 15 years ago now, was wouldn't it be a nice idea to see if we could do another release of dormice at the far end of Grafham Water, and then see about linking all those woodlands up around to create a metapopulation. So Brampton Wood would be one part of the core. We'd do a reintroduction at the far end, link it all up, and then you'd have basically a nice network of woodlands and hedgerows surrounding the Grafham Water, which is it's a water reservoir for the local water company, to create a metapopulation in that area. Plans are still kind of afoot. It will be quite a difficult job, but we did go and look around it recently to kind of see, is that something we might be able to do? And I'm still optimistic that one day we might kind of achieve that aim. But as I say, at the moment, dormice are still doing quite well there. Then 1994-95 was a release in Treswell Wood, which I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with, but it's generally considered to have failed. And there was a report at the time by Black, who wrote on the status of dormice at Treswell Wood. So this is 94-95, the second release that we did. And his conclusion was that the habitat was not ideal to support dormice, but no better sites could be found. And actually there wasn't the facilities or capacity to basically keep these dormice in captivity. If they either had to go out into the wood, or there was nowhere else really for them to go. So it was almost the best of a bad option. Dormice that were released weren't in great condition. Some had mites, some had alopecia. But they were put out anyway, again, because there was no kind of facility to keep them in captivity. These days, we would not release dormice in suboptimal health. There's no way. Even if they've thought they're too heavy, we will not be releasing them. They all go through vet checks. It's quite rigorous now and quite strict. So there's no way that would happen these days. But I say this was 20 odd years ago, and obviously the program was just starting to develop. But possibly one of the bigger reasons, I think, is actually that the reintroduction was put in or done at such a time when I think the local wildlife trust had just bought the woodland, and there was kind of going through a transition stage of actually moving the woodland back into more a coppice rotation, and there was just perhaps too much management activity to help kind of support and sustain the dormice at that time. And one which I've heard about, and it is reported on, that the last positive records of dormice in the wood were in a compartment where pigs had been introduced and controlled bramble. And one of the thoughts which I completely disagree with was actually the pigs were detrimental in helping the dormice kind of establish themselves in the wood, because pigs rooting around on the woodland floor will obviously eat any hibernating dormice. But at the end of the day, if you've got a healthy dormouse population, unfortunately losing a few shouldn't be a problem. I think it's just perhaps it was a bit the final nail in the coffin, but I don't think that should be really considered a reason. My suspicion would be, as I say, the ones above are, I think are far more reasonable as to why the first introduction didn't succeed. So then 1996, 97, we did a reintroduction in Stockton Dingle in Cheshire. This is quite a small wood, only an 8-hectare site. And when I first saw it, Stockton Dingle itself was owned by one landowner. Then the whole area got bought up by I can't think who it was now, but a lord of the manor basically, because he wanted to ride over the ground. And there was no management went into Stockton Dingle at all. So it's quite a small woodland area, and dormice kind of hung on there for probably till a couple of years ago. But there's actually no management at all. They dispersed a bit and moved out. I remember going up and writing a management plan for them, trying to get some of their woodlands into management, but they were never particularly interested in it, and we never really managed to get anything done at all. And consequently, the dormouse population now seems to have gone from Stockton Dingle. Little Linford Woods, quite an interesting one. This is in Buckinghamshire. So this was, you can see all the dots on the map, that's where all the boxes are put up. So this is a woodland, it's a 40-hectare woodland, say in Buckinghamshire. That's the M1 running through there, you can see. And there's a few things that have come out of Linford Wood. One is that half the wood was clear felled in 1986. So you've got 20 hectares of basically new woodland growing through, a succession of woodland. So the Dormouse Reintroduction went in 1998. And that was when you've had about half the woodland, so 20 hectares of woodland at about a 12-year aged habitat. 41 dormice were released, and then 6 years later, there had a peak count of 117 dormice in the wood in 2004. That was when you had half that woodland area was at about 18 years old. From that point, it slowly declined. The local volunteers did bits and pieces of management, but it was bits and pieces. And no dormice have been recorded in the boxes since 2016, because basically all the wood now is over 30 years old. So it does just show, in my eyes, that actually the early succession of vegetation is very important for dormice and to get them using boxes as well. Other things that are interesting in this site is you can see all the dots down by the motorway. So dormice moved out from Linford Wood, travelled down a hedgerow to the motorway, and then they've dispersed along the side of the motorway. And you can see they've certainly crossed a road, they've crossed a couple of B roads alongside the motorway, and they've also actually crossed over the motorway as well. One's been recorded on the other side of the motorway. My suspicion is they probably went through an underpass like this. There's no dormouse bridge or anything there at all, but it is full of a lot of farmers' junk. And I guess to a dormouse, if they'll travel through a metal mesh tunnel, there's no particular reason why farmers' junk couldn't act as an arboreal route for them. I suspect this is probably how one of them got across. But then there's also been fun engaged at Linford as well, because they are currently upgrading that section of the M1 to a smart motorway, which means there's a lot of vegetation clearance from the bank. I got called in to do a couple of media interviews because apparently they had to shut the M1 for 12 nights. And it was outrageous because when I got interviewed in the radio, it was people had to follow a diversion. It was outrageous shutting the motorway, all for dormice. We should have foreseen this when the reintroduction was done in 1998, and we should have planned and had contingency plans to help it all. So the scale of the works is quite significant. We're kind of keeping our fingers crossed that dormice will be hanging on. They seem to be at the moment. There are due to be 2 dormouse bridges going across at this site on the M1. So hopefully the population will hang on. And it'd be nice to think in years to come, we could actually do another reintroduction on the other side of the motorway. There is a suitable woodland about 8 miles away, but it would need quite close work with Highways England. So that could be quite an interesting project to do in due course. And there's also a tale at the end of this as well. The chap there in the pulling on the rope is John Prince. He's been involved with Little Linford Wood ever since the dormice went in, and he's always been convinced that dormice are somewhere in Linford Wood. Haven't been recorded in the boxes, as I say, since 2016, but he was determined to try and demonstrate their presence. So he put a high-level box up, and sure enough, after about 2 weeks, he recorded 1 dormouse. So not been recorded in boxes at kind of the shrub level where you'd normally put dormouse boxes, but there does seem to be at least an animal, if there's bound to be more than one, kind of running around higher up. So potentially some more interesting stories, I think, to come out of Linford Wood. Bubnall Woods in Warwickshire. This was a release in 1998, and I must admit, some woods, you can usually tell if you see woods which have dormice in, they just feel like nice woods. And unfortunately, some woods just don't. And I have to say, Bubbenhall Wood, when I saw it, just never felt like a particularly nice wood. This is long before our time. This has still been run by Royal Holloway. And they assured me when this had been put in that they'd had an agreement with the woodland owner that was a gravel extraction company, that they were going to do a lot of management on the woodland. They did absolutely nothing at all. In fact, kind of worse. Soon after the dormice had got in, they basically put this is a gravel extractor, a lengthy conveyor belt alongside a ride. So pretty much did no management on the wood at all, and actually in many ways actually worsened it. The wood itself, when I saw it, there's virtually no understory, so it was completely unsuitable for dormice, and there was just the gravel pit to stop this, and there seemed to be a little slurry bit down one end where all the hazel was dying off, presumably with water leaching out from the rubbish pit. So yeah, one of the bit of sad sights really. But better say it was done, and hopefully it should improve soon because it has now been bought by the local wildlife trust. So hopefully things will be looking up a little bit for Bubbenhall, and we'll start doing some management in that site, and it should start getting better. A beautiful site up in North Yorkshire was the site of the 1999 reintroduction. This was at Revo, and a nice wooded valley. This went on a private estate, and I must admit, alarm bells were ringing slightly when I first went to make my acquaintance with the gamekeeper, because it transpired that when the dormice were released and when they were put in, it was something that the gamekeeper had done, but he hadn't particularly told his boss. Because shortly after the boxes went in, his boss, whose name escapes me now, went round and asked him when all the dormouse boxes were going out, and was a bit surprised to find they were going to be there for the long time to monitor dormice. So I think, again, a lesson really, what we do now is we work very hard to make sure all interested parties are on board before we undertake any reintroduction at all, and we certainly talk a lot with the landowners to make sure they're happy and they're going to support this project into the longer term. Because again, Revo, no management done in the woodland suitable for dormice. There was a suspected hazelnut found at a local wildlife trust site, but nothing ever came of it. And my suspicion is they've gone from this site as well. But the one thing that the hazel up there and all the habitat looked pretty good at the time, but that was along the roadside and there just simply wasn't enough habitat. But the reintroduction itself was very, very, very well recorded by a chap, Jeff Oxford, and it appeared in the local Mammal Society magazine, and kind of just almost recorded the decline of the dormouse in the area. But again, really very little management done in the woodland, which is probably why the population didn't persist. Priestwood in Suffolk. This one kind of went in before we knew much about dormice in Suffolk. And again, another interesting one. So you see the map there is Priestley Wood. So the picture of the hedge is the connection hedge between Priestley Wood and Bonnywood. And as far as we were aware, when the dormouse were put in the year 2000, there were no dormice in the area at all. So they were put in Priestley Wood with the thought that they might expand and move out to Bonnywood over time. And then later on, some genetic works was done and actually found that there was a native population in Bonnywood, and they were interbreeding with the ones at Priestley Wood. So yeah, I mean, Bonnywood had been surveyed and had been looked for dormice before the reintroduction, but nothing found. So the reintroduction went ahead. But as I say, there does appear to be a native population there. But if nothing else, the Priestley release will have made the population obviously a bit more robust. But so that site's still doing quite well, and that's fine. So at this time, PTES have taken over the reintroduction. So the first one we did was at Malden Wood in Bedfordshire. So this is quite a large forestry commission woodland, and dormice doing fairly well there, in spite of the fact that there's not a huge amount of management going on by forestry commission, but I think just the size of the wood makes quite a difference. There does seem to be, there is evidence of certainly dormice moving out from the woodland in some of the hedgerows, so that's kind of good news. We've been asked to go up and advise a bit more on management of that woodland to see if we can help things and get things going. Almost one of the most disappointing things really of Bedfordshire is when I was last up there and talking to them, their general view was, well, pretty much all of Bedfordshire is going to be built on at some point, in which case actually a lot of those local hedgerows and local fields and local woodlands could be impacted or affected. How true that is or not, I don't know, but certainly Bedfordshire is not a big county, and as everywhere else, building does seem to be kind of coming in everywhere. So how well this will survive into the longer term, I don't know. But if we can get the Forestry Commission to improve their management, then hopefully the population will persist there. Bedford Purlieux this is one in Northamptonshire in 2000. This is also done in 2001. And again, interestingly, links in the dormouse as a species in terms of being a scrub species, because that map there, that little black area there is where the woodland was deer fenced. And most of the dormice turn up either on the woodland edge or in the deer fenced area. Because obviously that's, if you've got no deer coming in, that's where you're going to have your most densest, most scrubby areas, and that's where they tend to find most of the dormice in that area. Also, and I remember going up there, and again, this was within the deer fenced area, and seeing this bit of management that they'd done, and they were quite disappointed with this because the hazel wasn't, the hazel and the understory wasn't coming back very quickly. And they were fairly convinced, and I must not agree, it was probably due to the high canopy shading. It's just quite a good example from within that area that they've done some management work, but they've done all the coppicing work, but they simply hadn't, and it simply wasn't developing very quickly. So not well enough to encourage dormice to move in. So 2002, we did Hamps Valley, and I must admit, it's never great when you go up there, to visit a site and you find out that actually the area of Hamps Valley that they put dormouse boxes in and put a dormouse reintroduction is a woodland called Hellhole. But I must, two things stood out. One was that this woodland is on a very, very steep bank of a woodland, quite hard work getting up. And I must admit, in my early days of working for PTES, I remember visiting this site, and actually I was up there, I think it was in January, and I remember checking a box and actually found a dormouse in a box in January with snow on the ground, which was quite interesting. But again, this was one, there were native populations in Staffordshire, but this was kind of a reintroduction to bolster it up a little bit. But again, absolutely no management done on this site at all. And I'm sorry to say now there's no populations left in Staffordshire at all. So that's been the last kind of 20 years or so, we've lost all the native and the reintroduced populations in Staffordshire. And again, just kind of indicating if you don't do any management on these sites, then fundamentally you're likely to lose your dormouse population. Chambers Farm Wood in 2002. This was, I think this is one of our biggest successes, I have to say. This is a huge woodland, 347 hectares. It's a big old wood. And it's a bit of an odd wood as well, in terms of there's a number of individual old woodland compartments within the wood. And the rest is basically planted up agricultural fields. So Dormouse Reintroduction was done in one of the older areas. And there's been a very keen and very active group throughout, doing a little bit of coppicing and liaising with the local forester. This is also a forestry commission owned wood. And they've done an excellent job of both doing their own bit of habitat management and getting the forestry commission to do a fair amount of management. And the result of that's been that dormice have dispersed from this site. They've been picked up in other areas. I wouldn't say they're throughout the woodland, but they are in other areas of the wood. So this one has done remarkably well. This has done very well. The only thing that's slightly frustrating with this is I would like to do another reintroduction in this area in another woodland about 5 miles away. But the Forestry Commission aren't very keen on it, because if you introduce, well, the logic is if you introduce dormice to a Forestry Commission woodland, you might have a negative impact on the management, where you can turn around and say, we've already done that, because that's a state in Chambers Farm Wood, but they kind of don't go with that at all, and they don't particularly want to do it, which is a bit of a shame, because it would be a good chance to get another population in, and also look to increase the local metro population, make it a bit more stable. Into Lee Shaw's Wood in Derbyshire, and this was done in 2003. I think of all the reintroductions that we've done, I think this is probably the one that we probably shouldn't have done. It was the wood was owned by an older couple, and they bought it predominantly because there was going to be a local motorbike track that was like to come into the woodland, so they bought the wood to kind of protect it. When I saw it, it was pretty much all canopy sycamore. There was very little understory at all. And just the difficulties of managing a woodland of, in essence, big trees by an elderly couple was just nigh on impossible. So dormouse numbers declined and disappeared. They pretty much disappeared from the wood within 2 to 3 years. And again, it's not something we do these days. I must admit I'm very reluctant to do reintroductions at privately owned woodlands for exactly this reason. Is actually you often don't have the sort of management you'd like to kind of get the wood suitable for dormice. Hesel and Peterwood, we're back into North Yorkshire again. This is another privately owned woodland. They persisted here a bit, but this is really a plantation woodland. They were released in both Peterwood and Hesleywood, and they made their way down a hedgerow and then along the railway track for the population mix. But total of 62 dormice released in 2004, as I say, in both these woodlands. But again, because it's plantation, a lot of it got cut down. There was actually very little available habitat for dormouse left. And although they were quite keen, it was actually monitored for quite a long time. But I think dormouse probably disappeared from there perhaps 5 or 6 years ago. And again, it was really just due to inappropriate management, I suspect, which is why they probably went. And then 2005 in Monsaldale in Derbyshire, which is a beautiful site, I have to say. So if anyone knows Monsall Head, you can stand at Monsall Head and look down the valley, and you can see Monsaldale and where the dormice were released. Again, slight sad story on this one, I think, in terms of the whole site is a SSSI, so it's a site of special scientific interest. The problem is it's not designated as a coppice woodland. And yet I remember walking there at one time when we were trying to get some woodland management in, and I went in with 2 local coppice workers, and they thought that actually the woodland in Monsaldale was the biggest area of coppice that they knew of in Derbyshire. And yet the SSSI designation was for an ash woodland. So because it was designated an ash woodland, actually you get no support to do any coppicing work. So the dormouse population having gone in there is just about hanging on, but don't think it's going to last, because again, no management work's been done there at all. So this is a reintroduction when it was done. We wrote a report on how to try and get some coppicing work in there, fairly low-key stuff, just try and get some work in and get some done. But basically since 2005, no management work's been done there at all. And funnily enough, I did just have an email from the site manager a few weeks ago saying, can we do anything to help the dormouse population? But I have a nasty feeling it might be too little too late now. We should have been doing something kind of 10 years ago at least. but it just didn't happen. Then Bradfield Woods in Suffolk in 2006, and again, Bradfield Woods, very interesting woods. Some of you may know Bradfield Woods because it often gets reported on. So almost the biggest surprise is why dormice aren't here, what happened to them, because dormice certainly were recorded in this wood at one time, and then they seem to have become extinct. And we did a reintroduction there in 2006. So dormouse numbers did very well. So you can see, so the solid line, the solid red line and the solid blue line, what the dormouse numbers are doing. And as a comparison, the dotted blue line, the red line and blue line are from a site that the PTES own on the Isle of Wight. So red lines are spring numbers and blue lines are autumn numbers. But Bradfield population is doing very well, to say the least. And I suspect one of the reasons for that is it's a 70-hectare woodland. 20 hectares is in non-intervention, and 50 hectares is cut on a 2 hectare per year rotation. So in 25 years, you've basically gone around all your coppice area. Now, at any one time, that gives about 25 to 30 hectares in kind of a 5 to 20 year age structure, which is kind of that young scrubby structure, probably beloved by dormice. So actually you manage your wood well, and dormouse numbers do very nicely, thank you very much. So the wood is doing very well, and dormice are certainly occupying and certainly starting to shown to move out into the wider landscape as well. My suspicion as to why they died out is my suspicion there was kind of a hiatus in the mid-70s up to the kind of 80s, when there was no management done at all, so that coppice rotation stopped. And it's probably that the woodland just got too old, shaded everything out. You didn't have that younger successional habitat, and you didn't have any habitat suitable for dormice, so they disappeared. But as I say, fortunately they're back there now and doing very well. 2008, we're back in North Yorkshire again. This is Freeholders Wood in North Yorkshire. So there's 35 dormice released in this wood. Nice little wood, but not very big, only about 10 hectares. And this one, to say this is a managed woodland in North Yorks. Did have before, or when we put the unknown reason, it was rabbit fence, but only on 3 sides, which is never the best thing to do for rabbits. But I think that's now been rectified. So again, population doing very well. And again, one of the reasons is there's a good driver to keep woodland management going in this woodland. It's called Freeholders Wood, because any coppicing that's done here, the landowner, which is North Yorkshire Moors National Park, have to make the product of the coppice available to the local villagers for firewood. So there's an external pressure to kind of keep the management going, because the locals want firewood, which I just think is quite a nice driver really to kind of keep your woodland management going, to help the dormice, and the dormice population is doing pretty well there. Next door is another wood, Joseph's Wood, which is just an example of how potentially you don't really do well on or you need careful planning to try and plant a woodland. This was planted in the year 2000, and 20 years later it still pretty much looks like trees in a field, where you could have done a lot better in terms of your planting strategy. What you're under planting, you could have improved it greatly, but I just think they did a good demonstration of not how to plant a native wood, and I would hope if we do in future we could actually do a lot better than this. 2009, 2010, we're doing Warwickshire and to Windmill Naps, and we're just having a discussion with the site owners there now, because dormice again doing quite well there, but they're doing the same on the M42. They're upgrade. This is Windmill Naps lies next to the M42 just south of Birmingham. And they're upgrading that to a smart motorway again, and dormice are now back on the motorway embankment as well, the Windmill Nap, so they're there too. Again, Alwood, so Alwood also in Warwickshire. We've done a few in Warwickshire. I think we went into this woodland too early. It was a newly planted woodland. I think we went in too early in the management cycle. So we put the dormice in, and within 3 or 4 years, they were no longer there. And I think, again, it's due to the lack of suitable habitat. I think we went in too early. And I must admit, it's one I would hope we wouldn't repeat. Then after the 2012 site, we had the Channing review, because Natural England, since they're supporting some of this this programme, actually felt that they should at least do a review of it. So Paul Channon was commissioned to write a Dormouse Reintroduction review, and Paul had a couple of comments. One was he thought that the strategy should change from kind of one of consolidation, and that's what that map is. He was identified a focus area where we should look to release dormice, so in essence bulk up at the edge of the range. That's all very nice, but because we don't have the resources, capacity to spend a lot of time searching for reintroduction sites, we tend to wait for potential sites to come to us, which means by their very nature they could kind of be anywhere. And what we tend to do is try to favour sites where the dormouse population has the best chance of success, rather than trying to pick a specific geographic location. So we will do that if we have available sites, but we don't always get the available sites. We also suggested that sites should be clustered in small groups in order to create viable metapopulations, which is how we manage and how we run the programs now, rather than just reintroducing a single site. So we did create some, so we, on the back of this strategy, PTES wrote a proposed strategy for dormouse reintroductions, and we were looking at priority given to sites in a priority county, but we can't guarantee it, of course. But existing sites, we'll look for a new site within 5 kilometres of the original, and where we do a new reintroduction, we'll be looking for at least 2 sites, and we'll also investigate opportunities for landscape projects around those sites as well. So that was kind of the new proposal. So this is kind of what it looks like. You now, instead of just doing a release in site A and letting dormouse meander out to the countryside and hope they start to repopulate, we'll do at least 2 releases at a site, and the aim is there that dormouse will disperse in a variety of directions. At some point they should meet up, and obviously then you start to create your metapopulation both within the woodlands and within the hedge network as well, and that obviously makes your population much more robust to survive kind of the ups and downs. So this is some of you recognise this, I'm sure. This is obviously the Nottinghamshire reintroduction. So we did 3 in Nottinghamshire, 1 at Treswell Wood, 1 at Eaton Wood, and 1 at Gampston Wood. So Treswell Wood is that woodland up in the upper right, and then Gampston and Eaton are down at the bottom. So we did, I'd say, 3 reintroductions. All the woodlands are owned by the local wildlife trust, and also the reintroduction is promoted, helped create the Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group, which kind of helps all this as well. So the fact all the woods are owned by the Wildlife Trust, and there's a very keen and enthusiastic band of volunteers, means we've got there's a good project really in both monitoring the dormouse and liaising with the local landowners. But there was more that came out of Nottinghamshire as well, in terms of, I know Michael was walked around this, and Lorna did it as well. In the early days, we went out, we mapped or assessed the hedgerow connectivity between those 3 woodlands, between Eaton and Gampston and between Treswell, and came up with a hedgerow map. And this then led us at PTS to say, well, actually, we could do with a better way of quantifying hedgerow quality to try and get a better assessment of actually what's there and what it looks like. Oops. So that's the map that was produced there. So we actually then started looking at the DEFRA hedge survey, which was set up in 1999, I think. But it's now no longer running. And PTS also sits on HedgeLink, which is the HAP group, the Habitat Action Plan group. And we look to take over the DEFRA, the National DEFRA Hedgerow Survey. So we've got all their data. We've now basically reinvigorated the National Hedge Survey, and this is the idea is trying to show, well, it provides tools for volunteers to go out and survey hedgerows, and it also gives feedback information back to the landowner of how to kind of improve hedgerow management. And I just put this, rather than sharing more, I just put this diagram that we produced in, and the idea is to show that the hedgerows aren't you can't have a fixed state of a hedgerow. A hedgerow is a dynamic system, so what you want to try and do is keep it within that dense and well managed, but at some point it will either be over trimmed and start moving out to the right hand side, in which case you need to have either lay it, coppice it, or replant it, or alternatively, if you relax the regime too much, it'll start developing towards a line of trees, and again you need to bring some management to rejuvenate it. So the idea of this is to show that hedges are a dynamic system. You can't keep it in any one state. you have to manage it at some point to keep it going. And so we've developed, I say, the built on the DEFRA hedgerow survey. It's now available fully online if people are interested in doing it. And it will also give management advice to the landowners how to best manage a hedgerow as well. So kind of the work we did in Nottingham kind of led to us starting, in essence, another project to create all these kind of tools for people to use as well. Then 2016, we did Horbank. You'll recognise the name of freeholders. We did that one in 2008. So this was another kind of bulking up. So Horbank was about 4 or 5 miles away from freeholders. And the exciting thing about this one, I thought, was actually, if you look back to that 1885 report I started this whole talk off on, is actually dormice had mentioned in this Wensleydale Valley. In 1885, we know dormice were in this vale of Wensleydale, probably about 10 miles from this site. And we're looking to try and put dormice back within this area. Perhaps not your typical dormouse habitat that you think about in certainly from where I am down in Hampshire, but as I say, we know dormice were here. We know dormice were in North Yorkshire up to the 1960s. So, and there are trees and hedges around, so they can certainly live up here. And we also, on the back of this, we put together a Wensleydale project. There was a PTES funded project with various things to try and look to link those two sites. So they had an aim of surveying hedges, get some of the hedgerows back into management. They planted nearly 2 kilometres of new hedgerows. They managed a number of small woodlands and talked to the landowners to keep it going and kind of inform local landowners in the area as well. So that project's now coming to the end, but it has been very successful in terms of getting that habitat connectivity between those two sites in North Yorkshire. Then we did two Warwickshire reintroductions. This was at Wappenbury Wood and Ryton Wood, and this was again part of a big Heritage Lottery Fund bid, but this Dormouse reintroduction was fairly central to that bid, and this came under the Dunsmore Living Landscape project. And also now there's a 5-year project at both the woodlands in Warwickshire to pit tag dormice, so we can get some indications of where dormice are moving within the woodland in a novel habitat. So, we're driving scientific research on that as well. And the other thing we've started doing as well is where we can. One of the things that's starting to get a bit more of a concern is we have generally try and put 40 animals out now, which seems to work. The lowest number that we know about that have survived and doing quite well is 30 animals at Malden Wood, which is quite a difference if you again cast your mind back to when I started, and they released 11 animals from 2 family groups, and then they put out a further 6 animals the following year. Genetically, I do not think that's going to be a robust population. So what we're tending to do now is we'll revisit successful sites to do a further reintroduction, which is obviously will be completely new genetic stock. So we did in 2019, we visited Chambers Farm Woods and released 11 dormouse there. It's not a reintroduction. This is just a release purely to improve the genetic diversity of the population that's been reintroduced some years ago. And we did another top up or another release, I should say. It's not a top up. It is to improve the genetic variation in the population. We did another 11 dormice in Treswell Wood as well. So that's kind of progress to move on as well. So what have we learned after all this? Well, I think key to the success of the reintroduction is management. You don't manage for dormice, or at least manage with dormice in mind, then you're going to lose your population. Does seem to be, broadly, there does seem to be an indication that actually successional vegetation of kind of between 5 and 20 years seems to be most suitable for dormice. And there's obviously caveats attached to that. You need to think about canopy shading. You certainly need to think about potential impacts of deer. But in essence, I think, dormice are a scrub species in essence. It's just trying to get, well, what do we actually mean by that in terms of age? We know dormice can persist in small sites. For those familiar with some of the work that Pat Morris and Paul Bright did, it's long kind of been said that you need at least 20 hectares of good dormouse habitat for a self-sustaining population. But we know freeholders, dormice are living in freeholders, and it's only 10 hectares in size. So I think if you have connectivity within the landscape, but even in I think dormice can occupy quite small habitat patches. So So they do persist in small sites, and as I say, we do know from fairly small populations, so literally 30 dormice being released, they're still there in Malderwood and in other woodlands where we've done 30 animals, and they still seem to be doing reasonably well. People love dormice. I think that's actually quite an important one, really. Dormice aren't a pest. They're not a nuisance species. They are cute and fantastic. That's the fact that they're cute and people really like working with the species. That's very important, certainly for the reintroduction programme and certainly for dormouse conservation as a whole as well. We couldn't do the dormouse reintroductions without people and the local people getting completely engaged with this, because we're a London-based charity. I'm the only person who works on dormice. I need local people to kind of move it on and help with all this, because otherwise it's simply not going to work. And that's more likely to happen if people really enjoy working with the species. Reintroductions can promote funding. We do say there's been a couple of big grant bids come in. They promote getting more volunteers. They certainly can promote academic research, and they can certainly promote partnerships. I mean, we work with a lot of partnerships like the likes of Paint and Zoo, Zoological Society of London, Common Dormouse Captive Breeders Group, to kind of put all this together. So it certainly helps kind of bring organisations together. And dormice can certainly drive landscape change. And I know from some of the work that Nottingham have been doing in terms of working with some of the landowners, actually, I know we have been improving some of the hedgerows up there and some of the management of hedgerows. So certainly seem to be able to drive landscape change as well, which is something that's very important. So I'll leave you, not with my words, but with someone whose names I can never pronounce. So I saw this chap doing a talk at Zoological Society of London once, and his view was that species reintroductions are difficult, which I certainly agree they are. Most fail, which I also agree with that. Quite a lot do fail, but I think we certainly get a lot better. But they are worth doing in terms of it's just kind of a tool in the conservation toolbox. It's not going to answer the problems of conservation. If species are declining, we can't just reintroduce a few more and hope it works. But nonetheless, it is a tool that can go quite well. And I put that other bit in. This was from 2017. Every year in the papers around Christmas time, usually the press have a full page of things to look back over the year and think what's been a really successful year. So alongside this was in 2017. I think this was in the Eye. They recorded that 7 planets around the same size of Earth have been discovered that could potentially harbour life. How exciting is that? But not as exciting as the fact that rare hazel dormice were reintroduced to a woodland in Warwickshire in June. So we made the Eye as a reason to be cheerful in 2017. So I thought that's pretty good. Anyway, I hope that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of all the reintroduction sites. I hope that was interesting. And yeah, if you have any questions, yeah, I'll see what I can do.
Thanks, Ian. So we've got a question coming up. Ian, what's your favourite dormouse fact?
Favourite dormouse fact? I suppose my favourite dormouse fact would have to be that I think dormice are quite like us in terms of when they breed, they have 1 litter a year. Okay, so it's 4, not many of us have 4 litters, but they do. Then they have 1 litter. They look after the young quite carefully before they send them out into the big wide world. And again, it's not quite like us. I mean, dormice tend to do it for about a month, whereas we might do it for 30 years. But they like their food. They're quite specialist feeders. They like nice woodlands. So I think to me, I think dormouse shares a lot of similarities with us, which I always find quite touching.
Thank you. Second question, where are the reintroduced dormice sourced from?
There is a group, the Common Dormouse Captive Breeders Group, which consists of about 10 breeders. So all the dormice that are put out are captive bred. So where they come from is often we get members of the public, they might be cutting their hedge and they'll find a nest of dormice, or they'll find an adult dormice that get brought in. Sometimes you get some coming in from development work. So there's a constant kind of new supply coming in, but they're all looked after by captive breeders. There's a meeting of captive breeders in about April. which time all the dormice are then brought in, and they then go to Paynton Zoo or ZSL, Zoological Society of London, for quarantine to be fully health checked. That takes about 6 weeks. Then they're very carefully paired up to make sure that we get the best genetic mix for the population to get out, and then they're released and put out. But yeah, they're all captive bred.
Michael Walker, our data officer, would like to know what the impacts of climate change will be on dormice.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason, to be honest. I would very much like to make sure we keep the reintroduction programme going. I think it has a lot of benefits, and the climate change is one. Because the reality is we don't really know the precise impacts of climate change, but all the indications are that actually our weather is going to become more variable in terms of we are likely to get wetter, milder winters. And that's a problem for dormice, because if it was nice and cold and stayed cold for months, dormice would be quite happy. They just hibernate through that. The problem is variable temperatures. Is dormice can wake up, and if every time they wake up, they lose a little bit more energy, and at which point they just run out of puff, basically. So variable winters is not good for dormice. And the other problem that seems to be happening is we seem to get in wetter springs. And wetter springs is a problem for dormice because that delays breeding, or perhaps they won't breed at all, which obviously has a negative impact on the population. So I think climate change per se is not particularly good because it brings variability from a dormouse point of view. The advantage possibly in terms of reintroducing and doing the reintroductions further north is actually that climate transition slows as you go further north. But the reality is if we just kind of don't do it and just hope that everything will be all right, then it's actually, we really have restricted the population in southern England. And if it does get very variable and the population does start to suffer down here, without a reintroduction programme that's been ongoing for a while, yeah, it's difficult to know quite what the future will bring.
Thank you. Charlotte Jones, who's Keeping It Wild and Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group, you mentioned during 2014 Channing Review you don't have a resource to look for suitable sites and you wait for them to come to you. Would reintroductions be more successful if more resources were spent looking for suitable woodlands?
There's always a problem, and I think the difficulty, I have to say, is kind of land ownership. I think you could do it, you could target, and one of my thoughts, which we kind of sort of think about, is in terms of if you could target the major landowners. And I think something like you'd be looking at National Trust, Ministry of Defence, I can't remember, the Crown Estates. So there are some very big landowners, and almost go and get them on board might work. The problem with going out to a woodland, going out and almost driving around a county and saying, okay, we'll target these areas, that wood looks nice, let's try that one then. If it's a small landowner, it might look great now, but it might not look so great in 20 years' time, in which case you put an awful lot of resource into with no guarantees of long-term success. Personally, if we were going to target anyone else, I actually would really like to target the likes of Highways England and Network Rail. I think in terms of where we get our biggest bang for our buck, in terms of dormouse release or dormouse areas or dormouse suitable areas, will be on roadside verges. Because not only are that, if you kind of think of where the best areas of scrub, that's probably on roadside verges, and also obviously they have a broad connectivity route throughout the wider countryside as well. So that's who I'd really favour.
Yeah.
But I think on the one hand, with all these things, you'd probably do better if you spent, or you could do more if you spent more. It's just a question of, do you get kind of value for money on it?
Yeah. Jacob Hagen, who is the Warwickshire and Nottinghamshire volunteer. Hi Ian, given that dormice favour young successional habitat, is there scope for reintroductions outside of woodlands?
Yes, absolutely. I would love to do, I've already mentioned, I'd love to do one on the motorway verge. I'd also really like to do one, in fact we did think about doing one in near Coolcabby in Derbyshire, and actually it's kind of slap bang in the middle of the National Forest. So, okay, it's not quite no woodland, but it's actually a new novel woodland rather than the more ancient sites. But yeah, I think the key, the problem, I suppose, is that, and certainly with all the planting ambition at the moment, is almost as to where do you maintain that scrubby habitat that's not connected to some sort of woodland. We don't seem particularly to keep large patches of scrub But in principle, I think, yeah, I think we should be, I think dormice do live in a broader range of habitats than we once thought. So yeah, I think we should be flexible with that as well.
I've got one from Debbie. I'm assuming that's Debbie Alston, but I'm not sure. Hi Ian, was there due to be a reintroduction this year? Did it happen? Or if not, what happened to the dormice?
Yes, no, Common Dormouse Captive Breeders Group. So yes, there was. It was due to be in Cumbria. So the problem was that we heard fairly early on in lockdown. So the dormouse were with the breeders, and we heard from the Zoological Society of London that they were actually struggling, or would be struggling, to do the quarantine. Paynton kind of said they could take it all on, and we took an early decision to say that actually no, we're going to pull this, simply because it meant that dormice could have gone into quarantine and we didn't actually know what the outcome was going to be. And I must admit, I'm very glad we did, because we could have had dormice kind of spread at 2 different sites, and then it would have been quite difficult getting them back and doing anything with them, or we may have had to euthanize them. As it is, we haven't had to euthanize any at all. They've all just stayed with the breeders. I think some are being bred with, and we'll potentially do a bigger release next year, but it'll be at the same site. It'll still be at the site in Cumbria.
I think you already answered this. There's one from Nathaniel. What do you think about the potential for linear sites like motorways and railways to act as dispersal corridors for dormice? What can we do to promote their dispersal along these areas? So I think I will just start to say that this year we have had success in Nottinghamshire in terms of we had landowner permission from Network Rail to put some boxes up. I think I put them up maybe in February, March time, just before lockdown. And then during last month's monitoring check, we found our first dormouse nest along the railway bank. So we now know that the linear feature of the railway bank is allowing our dormice to move through the landscape, which is great. But I mean, in terms of other places around the country, have you heard anything, Ian, in terms of dispersal?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we did a report on trying to look at dormice in road verges using licensed return data, and what it appeared to be that relative to NDMP sites, so relative to National Dormouse Monitoring sites, is you're probably finding between 2 and 3 times, or you were recording between 2 and 3 times more dormice in boxes on roadside verges than you were in National Dormouse Monitoring sites. That was the indications. So yeah, I mean, the difficulty, I must admit, seems to be is kind of how you engage Highways England, how you engage the engineers to recognise that wildlife such as dormice, it's not just dormice, but wildlife in general, is important. And just building stuff and enabling people to go from A to B 5 minutes quicker than they could last time is not as important as actually protecting what's been here for 10,000 years.
Bradley Collins, I work for a company. There's a lot of improvements on the highway boundary on a motorway in London. Would the motorway sounds put the dormice off, or are they happy to live next to the motorways?
No, it doesn't seem to be a problem. I've certainly recall, well, in fact, I'd hate to usurp Leo's talk, but I do know Leo has a picture of a dormouse hibernation nest that's actually built in one of the steel posts by the crash barrier by the side of a hard shoulder. It's either by the side of a hard shoulder, or it's actually adjacent to a trunk road. And when remember visited, or when we went to some conferences in Europe, I remember there's a slide from one of the Germans that when they go and do their dormouse surveying, they'll drive along the motorway and they can pick out all the dormouse nests in the roadside vegetation. So no, being on roads, the road noise does not seem to be a problem. And the other thing we've not mentioned at all is in terms of why I think roads have a real value to dormice is it's usually an area of very dense scrub, but there's also no deer impact. So there's no deer impact, so it generally stays pretty dense scrub. And also there's quite often high trees are usually taken down from a health and safety point of view. So again, you've got plenty of light coming into that sort of habitat. So you've got pretty much excellent habitat created for dormouse. So yeah, I think it's just a question of, as I say, trying to work with the agencies to get things improved.
I'll just add to that. I do go down to Devon a few times a year to do some monitoring with Leo on one of his sites on the A30. And I always remark to him how incredible it is, because the noise, sometimes it's so noisy and you just can't believe that there's dormice here. And he gets such good numbers in that small bit of woodland along the A30. It's just incredible. So yeah, I think they are fine in terms of noise. So John Honeyman, who is our warden of Tresor Woods. Hi, John. What are the key factors that contribute to a viable population?
Well, it's often kind of been, in terms of, it's often kind of consider what helps and what does well. Always long. I mean, dormouse generally have always been considered successional or specialist feeders. I think they're probably more flexible in their diet than we've ever particularly given them credit for. Having said that, variety is good. In terms of obviously the plants and the berries and the nuts that are coming available is important, but also a variety of plants will have a variety of invertebrates which will support dormice. So variety is good, but I must admit, I think what overrides that is actually connectivity. I think you need, which is again why we've talked about kind of young successional vegetation, but in younger vegetation you generally have better connectivity at kind of the arboreal level. So I would say connectivity is probably the key thing. A varied woodland is important, but I think dormice are probably more flexible in their food. So those are things we can do something about. Unfortunately, what we can't do something about almost goes back to what Michael said, is what we can't do anything about is the weather. And fundamentally, if you've got only a small population and you have a mild winter or a variable temperature winter, or you have a very wet spring, it doesn't take that long to tip the dormouse population over the edge. Which again also comes back to, well, why is the habitat so important? Because that's something we can do something about. So that's, I would say connectivity is key, but variety as well to say for food sources.
Thanks, Ian. I'm just conscious that we're running out of time. There are a couple of more questions. Are you happy to answer them, or did you want me to forward them and I'll send them round? Positive or negative impacts of roads on dormice, whether for dispersal, fragmentation changes in habitat quality, or road traffic collisions, etc.
So is this a consultant or?
I think I was a student. I'm not sure.
Okay. The short answer is no. Basically, you kind of think it's one of those things that we've been mitigation, or dormice have been linked in with development for years, and we've been trying to do something about it for years. And if you're a developer on any sort of scheme, so a new road scheme coming in, and dormice are present, a dormouse mitigation plan will be written. So any dormouse habitat destroyed, there'll be compensatory planting. The works will be done in such a way to minimise risk to dormice. That's all been in place for ages. But as far as I'm aware, not a single piece of work has been written up to say, well, actually, this was the dormouse population to start with. This is what we did in the middle. This is how we tried to look after them. And this has been the outcome. And not a single piece of work has been done on that, of which I'm aware. And which I think is an absolute tragedy. We spend an awful lot of money and an awful lot of time trying to write licenses and plans and everything out. And we just kind of put them all in the hope that they work. And we actually have no idea at all. There are various things afoot now to say, well, actually, can we change things a bit? I hope so. The PTES, we are trying to get some information in because potentially there's quite a lot of money to change some of this stuff. And if we're going to change it, we should try and do it for the better and make sure we know what the outcomes are. And if they work, fantastic, let's do more of that. And if they don't, well, fine, let's change it. But unfortunately, we don't know.
Thank you. Bradley's returned his question and said he's the one that asked about the London motorway.
Yep.
He's had some EDF funds to work on motorway verge improvements, and he'd be very interested in looking into this with you. So is it okay if I give him your contact details, Ian?
Yep, certainly. Yep.
Okay. Is PTES doing any work lobbying on HS2 on the potential of helping dormice by planting and managing hedgerows along the line.
I must admit, we're not actually a lobbying group. We're quite a smallish charity. We're actually more a grant-giving body, and we've never particularly been a lobbying group at all. So what we tend to do, and the way we tend to come in it, is actually we provide training and advice and help to consultants rather than actually lobbying. As we say, it's not something we particularly do. So it's difficult to see why we'd start. And from what I've heard so far, yeah, HS2 would fit in with all other plans, but from what I've heard so far from all surveys done, there's been no records whatsoever any dormouse being found on the proposed route. But having said that, one would hope that they would take all opportunity to improve verges and make them suitable.
Last question. Can dormice persist individually, full life cycle, hibernation, breeding, etc., and at viable populations, don't know what's going on here, in hedgerows alone, or only transit routes between habitat blocks? I think basically he's asking, can a hedgerow sustain a dormouse population?
Yes. We had a talk, because I also chair the Hampshire Dormouse Group, and I remember we had a talk from one of the county ecologists. We're quite lucky in Hampshire. So I was mesmerised what's on the screen. We had a talk by Tristan Norton, who's one of the county ecologists, and his comment was within the county of Hampshire that they were getting quite a number of records that were from hedgerows with no apparent associated woodlands. And we know that they can do that down in Devon. I wasn't aware they do it up in Hampshire, but it seemingly dormice can. We're certainly getting indications that that this is happening elsewhere. And I kind of think there's a big research question over how well or what sort of size of a hedgerow network does it need to sustain a dormouse population, and how is that influenced by management? But my suspicion is, yeah, almost certainly hedgerow networks by themselves can support dormouse populations.
Super, thank you. I think obviously we're coming up to 8:45 now, so we're going to draw this to a close. I just want to say a huge thank you, Ian, for giving up your time to give us all this information. As I say, we will be doing some more webinars in the future, so just keep an eye on our social media and our website. We'll obviously, if you're happy for us to do so, if just email the events email again, we can put you on our mailing list and just give you any information of what's coming up. So just keep an eye, as I say, on social media, and thank you everyone for joining us, and take care. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Michael.